The rain came down like nickels on the cobblestones of Carroll Gardens that October night in 1958, each drop echoing off the pavement with the weight of something owed. Inside the basement of Our Lady of Peace Church, beneath the flickering bulbs that had witnessed 1,000 confessions, Salvatore Vitale sat across from his eldest son and made the decision that would end their family line forever. Not with violence from the outside, but with the slow, terrible mathematics of blood protecting blood. The question wasn't whether Michael Vitale would die. The question was whether God would forgive the hand that pulled the trigger, whether the Virgin Mary statue in the corner would keep her eyes closed when Anthony put the gun to his younger brother's head. Salvatore had built an empire on silence and discipline, on the understanding that family came first, always first, until the moment family became the poison. Now sitting in that damp basement with the smell of incense and mildew mixing in the air, he wondered if there was any difference between protection and murder, between loyalty and the slow death of the soul. Before we continue this story of the Vitale family and the price they paid for purity, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city, which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. Brooklyn in 1958 was a kingdom of brick and shadow, where the elevated trains rattled overhead like the breathing of some industrial beast, and where men like Salvatore Vitale ruled from storefronts and social clubs that never quite seemed to close. The Vitale family controlled the waterfront from Red Hook to Sunset Park, every longshoreman's union card passing through their hands, every shipment that came off those rusty freighters carrying a tax that no government would ever see. Salvatore had come from Sicily as a boy of 9, his hands already calloused from olive groves, his eyes already old from watching the Black Hand collect its tributes from his father's farm. He understood early that America was no different than the old country, only the names changed. The streets got wider, the buildings taller. Power still lived in silence, in the unspoken understanding that some men gave orders and other men obeyed, and the distance between those two stations was measured in blood and time. He had married Lucia Amato in 1925, a match arranged by both families in a restaurant on Mulberry Street, over plates of linguine and glasses of wine that someone else had paid for. She was 16 and wore a white dress that her mother had sewn, her hands trembling as she said the vows in a church that smelled of candle wax and the sweat of the faithful. Salvatore was 22 and already earning for the Bucciano family, already marked as someone who could keep quiet under pressure, who understood that questions were more dangerous than bullets. They had produced 3 children in those years, when Brooklyn was still half farmland and half factory, when the neighborhood smelled like bread from the bakeries and oil from the shipyards, when immigrants like them could still believe they were building something permanent. Anthony came first in 1927, a serious child who never cried, who watched his father's visitors with dark eyes, and learned early to recognize which men you greeted and which men you pretended not to see. Michael arrived 2 years later, louder, hungrier, his mother's favorite from the moment he drew breath. And then Maria in 1933, the daughter Salvatore had wanted to keep innocent, to shelter from the machinery of the life he'd built, though he'd already begun to understand that innocence was a luxury his world didn't offer. By 1958, the Vitale operation had expanded beyond anyone's early expectations. They controlled 3 union locals, had partnerships with families from Boston to Philadelphia, moved money through a network of legitimate businesses, diners and dry cleaners and trucking companies, where the books told 2 different stories depending on who was reading them. Anthony ran the day-to-day operations now, his father slowly stepping back, watching his eldest son navigate the delicate politics of tribute and territory with the same methodical precision Salvatore himself had used. Anthony was 41, married to a woman named Catherine from a respectable family in Bay Ridge, though they had no children after 10 years of marriage, a fact that Lucia whispered about to her sisters over coffee, wondering if God was punishing something, though she never said what. He dressed well, kept his hair neat, spoke softly and carried himself with the dignity of a man who never needed to raise his voice, because everyone already knew the consequences of disappointing him. Michael was different, always had been. At 39, he was still single, still living in an apartment above one of the family's social clubs on Court Street, still showing up to Sunday dinners at his parents' house with the smell of perfume on his collar and the restlessness of someone who'd never quite settled into the role assigned to him. He handled collections, managed some of the gambling operations, worked with the bookmakers who ran their business out of barbershops and candy stores. But there was something loose about him, something that made Salvatore uneasy, even when he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. Michael smiled too easily, talked too much, spent money in ways that attracted attention, drove a new Cadillac every 2 years, wore suits from Manhattan tailors, took women to restaurants where the waiters knew his name. In a business built on anonymity, on the art of being forgettable, Michael Vitale stood out, and that was dangerous. The trouble had started 6 months earlier, in April, when the cherry blossoms were blooming in Prospect Park, and the neighborhood was coming alive after a hard winter. One of the bookmakers, a nervous man named Paulie Greco, who ran numbers out of a newsstand on Fifth Avenue, had come to Anthony with a concern. The math wasn't adding up. Collections from the waterfront cruise were down, not by much, maybe 5 or 6%, but consistent, week after week. At first, Anthony had blamed it on the economy, on the dock workers having less to gamble, on the usual fluctuations of an illegal business. But Greco kept coming back, kept showing him the ledgers with their columns of figures that told a story if you knew how to read them. Money was disappearing somewhere between collection and delivery. Someone was skimming. And in a family operation where trust was the only currency that mattered more than cash, skimming was a death sentence. Anthony had spent 2 months investigating quietly, carefully, telling no one except his father. He'd followed the money backward through the network of collectors and runners, checking and rechecking the numbers, talking to men who worked the docks and bars where the bets got placed. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. The missing money traced back to accounts Michael handled. Not all of them. Not obviously, but enough. 5,000 here, 3,000 there. Over 6 months, it added up to $40,000. Enough to buy a house, enough to start a new life somewhere else, enough to make a man think he could escape the gravity of the world he'd been born into. But it wasn't just the money. That could be explained, could be paid back, could be punished with a beating and a demotion, and the understanding that second chances didn't come twice. What made it unforgivable was the other information Anthony had uncovered, the details that kept him awake at night in the bedroom next to his sleeping wife, staring at the ceiling and wondering if loyalty meant anything anymore, or if it was just another lie men told themselves to justify the things they did. 3 months earlier in July, 2 FBI agents had been spotted having coffee with someone at a diner in Borough Park, far enough from the neighborhood that they thought no one would notice. But people always noticed. The men who kept the Vitale family safe were everywhere, watching, reporting back. The person meeting with those agents, caught in a photograph taken from across the street through a telephoto lens some private investigator had sold them, was Michael Vitale. His face was unmistakable. The photograph lived now in a safe in Salvatore's study, and every time the old man looked at it, something died a little more inside his chest, some belief in the permanence of blood, the sanctity of family. That was when the question had first been asked. Late one night in June, after everyone else had gone home from the house on President Street, where Salvatore and Lucia still lived in the same brownstone they'd bought in 1935. Anthony had brought the evidence to his father, laid it out on the dining room table like a prosecutor presenting a case. The photographs, the ledgers, the testimonies from men who'd seen Michael acting strange, nervous, making phone calls from pay phones instead of from the club, leaving town on weekends without saying where he was going. Salvatore had looked at it all, his reading glasses reflecting the lamplight, his face carved from stone showing nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "What do you think we should do?" And Anthony had answered the only way he could, the way he'd been trained since childhood, to answer questions about threats to the family. "We handle it. The way we handle everything." But handling it meant killing his brother. And even in a world where murder was a business expense, where bodies disappeared into landfill sites and nobody asked questions because everyone already knew the answers, there were rules. Family was different. Blood was different. You could kill a soldier for disobedience, a partner for betrayal, an enemy for competition. But killing your own son, your own brother, required a calculation that went beyond the mathematics of profit and loss. It required certainty. It required proof that couldn't be questioned. And it required the understanding that once that line was crossed, there would be no going back, no forgiveness, no redemption. The family would be protected, yes. The empire would survive. But the price would be extracted from everyone who participated, a payment that would come due not in this life, but in the weighing of souls that Salvatore still believed in, despite everything, despite the thousands of sins he'd committed in the name of survival and prosperity. So they had spent the summer gathering more evidence, watching Michael more closely, looking for proof that would make the decision inevitable. They'd put men on him, surveillance that Michael was either too arrogant or too stupid to notice. They documented his meetings with the federal agents 3 more times over August and September. They confirmed the missing money, traced it to a bank account in Philadelphia, opened under a false name, but with Michael's signature. They discovered he'd been inquiring about properties in Florida, looking at waterfront houses in Miami Beach, the kind of places men went when they were planning to disappear. And most damningly, they found testimony from a man inside the FBI's New York office, a clerk named Danny Rizzo, whose nephew worked for the Vitale family and who passed along information for $500 a month. Rizzo confirmed that Michael Vitale was indeed cooperating with a federal investigation into waterfront corruption, providing information about union activities, about relationships between the family and local politicians, about the structure of their gambling and loan sharking operations. He wasn't giving them everything, not yet, but he was building a case, feeding them details that would eventually let them move against the entire organization. The question wasn't why. Anthony thought he understood that part. Michael had always been weak, always wanted more than his position allowed, always resented living in his older brother's shadow. The money he'd stolen was probably for his escape. The cooperation with the FBI was his insurance policy. If the family fell, he'd be protected. If they didn't, he'd already be gone, living under a new name with enough cash to start over. It was almost smart in a desperate, short-sighted way. What Michael hadn't counted on was how thorough Anthony could be. How patient, how willing to watch his own brother dig his grave one shovelful at a time before finally pushing him into it. By October, the evidence was complete. Anthony had presented it all to his father again, this time with recommendations. They needed to move quickly before Michael realized he'd been discovered, before he ran or before the FBI decided to make their move. They needed to make it look like an accident or a disappearance, something that wouldn't raise questions from law enforcement or from the other families who might see internal violence as weakness. And they needed to do it themselves, family handling family, no outsiders, no soldiers who might talk or who might use the knowledge as leverage later. Salvatore had listened to all of it, nodding slowly, his hands folded on the table in front of him, the age spots visible on his knuckles, the arthritis that made his fingers stiff in the cold. When Anthony finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. Then he'd said something Anthony would never forget. When you kill your brother, you kill part of yourself. Make sure it's the part that deserves to die. The decision was made on October 15th, a Wednesday evening when the temperature had dropped and the first real cold of autumn was settling over the city. They would do it on Friday, October 17th. They would call Michael to a meeting at the church basement, a place he wouldn't suspect because it was consecrated ground, because their family had been donating to Our Lady of Peace for 30 years, because Father Dominic, who ran the parish, was on the Vitale payroll and knew better than to ask questions about meetings held after hours. Anthony would be there. Salvatore would be there. They would tell Michael they'd discovered a problem with one of the union locals, that they needed his help figuring it out, that it was family business and required family discretion. Michael would come because he still believed he was safe, because blood protected blood, because he couldn't imagine his own father and brother would be the ones to end him. They would kill him quickly. Anthony would do it, one shot to the back of the head, the way the old Sicilians had done it for centuries, clean, final, respectful in its own terrible way. They would wrap the body in canvas and transport it in the trunk of Salvatore's car to a construction site in Queens, where the family had connections, where the foundation for a new apartment building was being poured the next morning. Michael Vitale would become part of the city he'd tried to escape, mixed into concrete, supporting the weight of families who'd live above him for decades without knowing what held them up. After, they would tell Lucia that Michael had disappeared, that he'd probably run off with some woman or gotten into trouble with gambling debts, that boys like him sometimes just vanished when the pressure got too heavy. She would know the truth, of course, mothers always knew, but she would accept the lie, because the alternative was admitting that her husband had murdered their son, that her eldest had killed her youngest, that the family she'd built her life around was built on a foundation more murderous than she'd ever allowed herself to acknowledge. Maria would know too, but she'd been keeping family secrets since she was old enough to understand that some conversations ended when she walked into the room. The women would grieve privately, light candles at church, say rosaries in their bedrooms, and never speak Michael's name again except in whispers. That was how these things worked. That was the price of maintaining the empire. The rain hadn't stopped by Friday evening when Michael Vitale parked his Cadillac on Union Street, half a block from Our Lady of Peace. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, his collar open, his hair slicked back the way he'd been wearing it since high school. He looked relaxed walking toward the church entrance, his hands in his pockets, taking his time, like a man who had no reason to fear the night or the family that had summoned him. Above him, the streetlights were just coming on, casting yellow pools of illumination on the wet sidewalk. The neighborhood was quiet, people inside having dinner, televisions glowing through curtained windows, the smell of cooking meat and tomato sauce drifting from the row houses that lined the street. Michael nodded to an old woman sitting on her stoop despite the cold, someone's grandmother who probably knew his mother, who'd watched him grow up. She nodded back, her face impassive, her rosary beads moving through her fingers in the automatic rhythm of prayer. The church's side entrance was unlocked, the way it always was when someone from the family needed to use the basement. Michael descended the concrete stairs, his shoes echoing in the stairwell, the temperature dropping with each step down. The basement was a large room with a low ceiling, fluorescent lights, linoleum floor, metal folding chairs stacked against one wall. It smelled like every church basement in Brooklyn, like coffee and dust and the accumulated moisture of being underground. Salvatore was already there, sitting at a small table with a file folder in front of him. Anthony stood near the far wall, his back to a water heater, his arms crossed, his face expressionless. Father Dominic was nowhere to be seen. The priest made himself scarce when family business was being conducted on church property. His arrangement everyone understood. Michael smiled when he saw them, the easy smile of someone who'd been charming his way through life since childhood. Popped. What's this about? He moved toward the table, not suspicious yet, just curious, maybe slightly annoyed at being called out on a Friday night when he'd had plans with a girl who worked at a department store on Flatbush Avenue. Salvatore didn't smile back. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Michael, we need to talk." Something in the old man's voice made Michael hesitate, some tone he'd heard before but never directed at him, the voice Salvatore used when things were serious, when there would be no joking, no charm, no way to talk your way out of whatever was coming. Michael pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, his eyes moving between his father and his brother, trying to read the situation, his smile fading. "What's going on? Did something happen?" Salvatore opened the file folder. Inside were the photographs, the bank records, the testimony from Danny Rizzo, everything they'd collected over the past 6 months. He pushed it across the table toward Michael, letting him see it all, giving him a chance to understand. "This is what's going on, Michael. This is what you've been doing." The words fell into the basement like stones into deep water, heavy with finality. Michael looked down at the papers, his face going pale, the color draining from his cheeks as he recognized what he was seeing. For a moment he said nothing, his mind probably racing through excuses, through lies, through calculations of whether he could run or fight or talk his way out. Then he looked up at his father, and something in his expression changed, a resignation settling over his features like a mask. "How long have you known?" Salvatore's voice was steady, almost gentle, long enough to be sure, long enough to give you every chance to come to us, to tell us the truth, to ask for help if you were in trouble. But you didn't. You kept stealing. You kept meeting with them. You kept building your escape, thinking we wouldn't notice, thinking family meant you were protected from the consequences of betrayal. Michael's hands were shaking now, resting on the table in front of him, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm. He didn't try to deny it. What else was there to say? The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, he looked at Anthony, still standing against the wall, still silent. "Tony, please. I'm your brother. We grew up together. Remember when we were kids? Remember how I used to follow you everywhere? You taught me how to play stickball. You taught me how to fight. We're blood. That has to mean something." Anthony finally spoke, his voice flat, emotionless, the voice of someone who'd already mourned what he was about to do. "It means I'm the one who has to do this instead of someone else. That's what it means. Because you're right. We're blood. And blood handles blood. No one else. Just us." Michael turned back to his father, desperation creeping into his voice now, the reality of the situation beginning to settle over him like ice water. "Pop, listen to me. I can explain this. The money, I was in debt. I was going to pay it back, I swear. The agents, they were putting pressure on me. They knew about some things. They threatened to arrest me if I didn't cooperate. I didn't give them anything important. I was stalling. I was trying to figure out how to get out of it. Please, I'll fix this. Just give me a chance." Salvatore shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with something that might have been sadness if you looked closely enough, if you knew him well enough to recognize the way pain moved across his face. "There's no fixing this, Michael. You made your choices. Now we make ours. The family comes first. It always comes first. Your mother and I, we raised you to understand that. We gave you everything. Position, money, respect. And you threw it away because you were greedy, because you were weak, because you thought you could be smarter than the rest of us." Michael stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor, his body tensing like he might try to run. But there was nowhere to go. The stairs were behind Anthony. The only other exit was locked. And even if he made it outside, where would he run? To the FBI, to some other family, to a life looking over his shoulder forever, knowing that the people who'd raised him wanted him dead. Anthony moved forward from the wall, his hand reaching into his jacket, pulling out a pistol that had been cleaned and loaded that afternoon. A revolver that couldn't be traced because it had been bought in 1946 from a soldier returning from the war and had changed hands a dozen times since. Michael saw the gun, and something broke inside him. The last fragment of hope or denial or whatever had been keeping him standing. He sat back down heavily, his hands coming up to cover his face, his shoulders shaking. "Not here," he said, his voice muffled. "Not in a church, please God, not here." But Salvatore's face was stone. "God doesn't live in basements, son. He lives upstairs, where the light comes through the stained glass. Down here is just us, just family, just the consequences of what you've done." Anthony came around behind his brother's chair. Michael didn't turn around, didn't fight, didn't beg anymore. Maybe he understood that some things were inevitable, that some prices had to be paid, that in this world there were no second chances for the kind of betrayal he'd committed. Or maybe he was just tired. Tired of running, tired of lying, tired of trying to be something other than what he was. The weak son in a family that rewarded only strength. Anthony pressed the barrel of the revolver against the back of Michael's head, right where the skull met the spine. The killing spot every man in their world knew about. Michael's hands were still over his face, his breathing ragged, his body rigid with fear. "Tell Ma I'm sorry," he whispered. "Tell her I loved her. Tell her I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Salvatore stood up from the table, his knees creaking, his body suddenly feeling every one of his 63 years. He walked to where his sons were, the living and the about to be dead, and he placed his hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture that might have been comfort or benediction, or simply the acknowledgement that this was the end. "I'll tell her," he said quietly. "I'll tell her you were thinking of her at the end, that you went peacefully, that you understood. She won't believe it, but I'll tell her anyway, because that's what fathers do. We lie to protect the people we love, even when the lies hurt more than the truth. The gunshot was thunderous in the enclosed space, echoing off the concrete walls, the smell of cordite filling the air instantly. Michael's body slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud, blood spreading across the papers and photographs, obscuring the evidence of his crimes with the evidence of his punishment. His hands fell away from his face, dropping to his sides, twitching once, and then going still. The basement was silent except for the ringing in their ears from the gunshot, except for the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond the lights, except for Salvatore's breathing, heavy and labored, like a man who'd just carried something impossibly heavy up a steep hill. Anthony stood there for a moment, the gun still in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel, his face expressionless. He'd killed men before, men who'd threatened the family, men who'd stolen from them, men who'd broken the rules everyone agreed to live by. But those men had been strangers, or close to it. This was different. This was the boy he'd protected in schoolyards, who'd slept in the bed next to his when they were children, who'd stood next to him at their father's side when they learned the family business. And now that boy was dead by his hand, blood cooling on metal furniture in a church basement, while upstairs someone was probably lighting candles and asking God for guidance. Salvatore reached out and took the gun from his son's hand, his movements slow, deliberate. He placed it on the table next to Michael's body, then pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the handle carefully, removing Anthony's fingerprints, though it didn't matter, because the gun would be destroyed anyway, dropped into the East River in pieces before morning came. "Go home," he told Anthony. "Go home to your wife. Tell her you were working late. Have dinner. Watch television. Act like nothing happened. I'll handle the rest." Anthony looked at his father, his eyes searching the old man's face for something, permission or understanding or maybe just confirmation that what they'd done was necessary, that the empire was more important than one man's life, even when that man was family. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Pop, Salvatore cut him off with a shake of his head. Don't say anything. It's done. That's all that matters. We did what we had to do. Now we live with it. That's our burden. That's the price of leadership. You'll understand that better as you get older, when you have sons of your own and you have to make decisions that tear your heart out. But you'll make them anyway, because that's what it means to be the man who's responsible for everyone else. Now go, and don't come back here, ever. This place is finished for us." Anthony left without another word, climbing the stairs slowly, his legs heavy, his heart heavier. He emerged into the October night, the rain still falling, the streets still quiet, the neighborhood still going about its business, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in the underground architecture of their world. He walked to his car parked 2 blocks away and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, his hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing, trying to understand how you were supposed to go home and eat dinner and pretend to be human when you just killed your brother in a church basement because business required it. Eventually, he started the engine and drove home to Bay Ridge, to the house he shared with Catherine, to the wife who would take one look at his face and know something terrible had happened, but who would never ask, because that was the agreement they'd made when they got married, that there would be parts of his life she wouldn't touch, rooms in his soul she wouldn't enter, prices he'd paid that would never be discussed. Back in the basement, Salvatore stood over his son's body, his hand still resting on Michael's shoulder, feeling the warmth leaving the flesh, the transition from person to corpse happening in real time. He thought about the day Michael was born, how tiny he'd been, how Lucia had cried from joy and pain, how he'd held that infant and made promises about protection and provision that he'd kept until the moment they became impossible. He thought about birthdays and Christmases, about teaching both his boys to ride bicycles on President Street, about the way Michael had laughed, loud and infectious, when he was happy. He thought about all the things that made a person real, all the moments that accumulated into a life, and how none of that mattered when the person betrayed the only thing that kept everyone safe. The cleanup crew arrived 40 minutes later. 2 men who'd done this kind of work for the Vitale family for years, who knew how to wrap a body and transport it without leaving evidence, who understood that discretion was worth more than money in this business. They didn't ask questions, didn't express sympathy, just went about their work with professional efficiency, rolling Michael's corpse in heavy canvas, securing it with rope, carrying it up the stairs and loading it into a plumber's van parked in the alley behind the church. Salvatore watched them work, his face showing nothing, his mind somewhere else, maybe back in Sicily where his own father had made similar decisions about loyalty and survival, where the code they lived by had been established centuries ago by men who understood that empires required sacrifice, that power demanded blood, that family was both the most sacred and most expendable thing in the world. By midnight, Michael Vitale's body was in Queens, being lowered into a foundation hole 40 feet deep, covered with gravel and sand, waiting for the concrete that would arrive at dawn. By morning, he would be erased, transformed from person to building material, his bones supporting the weight of strangers who would never know his name. And Salvatore Vitale would go home to his brownstone in Carroll Gardens, climb the stairs to the bedroom where his wife pretended to sleep, and lie next to her in the darkness, listening to her breathe, knowing she knew, knowing she would never ask, knowing they would both carry this silence until their own deaths, when whatever judgment waited beyond this life would finally extract the full price of what they'd done to protect their empire. The days after Michael's disappearance moved slowly, each hour heavy with the weight of secrets that everyone knew but nobody spoke. Lucia Vitale stopped sleeping through the night, her footsteps creaking on the floorboards at 3 in the morning as she paced the house, moving from room to room like a ghost haunting her own life. She lit candles at the Virgin Mary statue in her bedroom, her lips moving in silent prayer, her rosary beads clicking through her fingers with the rhythm of condemnation and forgiveness, though which she was asking for nobody could say. She made dinner every night like she always had, sauce simmering on the stove for hours, the smell of garlic and basil filling the kitchen, setting 4 places at the table even though only 3 people sat down to eat. The empty chair where Michael used to sit, becoming a monument to all the things that couldn't be discussed. Salvatore went through the motions of investigating his son's disappearance, making calls to contacts in other cities, putting out word through the network of families and associates that Michael Vitale was missing, that anyone with information should reach out, that the family would be grateful for help finding their lost boy. It was theater, performed for the benefit of anyone who might be watching, the FBI agents who'd lost their informant, the soldiers in the organization who needed to believe their bosses wouldn't kill family without overwhelming cause. Some people accepted the story, others understood exactly what had happened, but had the good sense to act like they believed the lie. That was how these things worked. Everyone participated in the fiction because the fiction protected everyone. Maria Vitale took her mother to church every morning, the 2 women walking side by side down President Street to Our Lady of Peace, their heads covered with scarves, their hands clutching prayer books, their faces composed into masks of worry and faith. Maria was 25 now, unmarried despite her mother's increasingly desperate efforts to arrange matches with suitable boys from good families. She worked as a secretary at a law firm in downtown Brooklyn, took the subway every morning, lived in a studio apartment in Park Slope that her father paid for. She was beautiful in the way women in their family were beautiful. Dark eyes and strong features, the kind of face that made men look twice and then look away when they remembered whose daughter she was. She'd been close to Michael when they were young, before the family business had driven wedges between everyone, before she'd understood that being close to anyone in this world meant being complicit in their sins. She knew what had happened, not the details, not the exact how or where or when, but she knew the essential truth. Michael had been killed because he'd betrayed the family, and Anthony had been the one to do it because that's what eldest sons did when their fathers were too old or too reluctant to pull the trigger themselves. She'd figured it out that Friday night when her father had come home late and her mother had been sitting in the living room in the dark, not crying, just sitting, staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap like she was already in mourning. Maria had asked where Michael was, and her father had said he didn't know, which was the first lie, and that they'd find him, which was the second. She'd looked in his eyes and seen the truth, the terrible knowledge that Michael was never coming home, that he'd been erased not by strangers, but by the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. The FBI came around 3 weeks later, Two agents in dark suits who knocked on the door of the brownstone on President Street and asked to speak with Salvatore Vitale. They sat in the living room, on the good furniture that Lucia kept covered in plastic, except for holidays and special occasions, their notebooks out, their questions careful and probing. They wanted to know when Salvatore had last seen his son, what Michael's state of mind had been, whether there had been any unusual phone calls or visits, whether Michael had mentioned any trouble, any debts, any reasons someone might want to harm him. Salvatore answered every question with the practiced vagueness of someone who'd been dealing with law enforcement for 40 years, giving them nothing useful, expressing appropriate concern and confusion, playing the role of worried father so convincingly that even he almost believed it. The agents asked about Michael's cooperation with their investigation. Salvatore acted surprised. What investigation? Michael hadn't mentioned anything about federal agents. Was he in some kind of trouble? Should the family be worried? The agents exchanged glances, recognizing the game being played, but unable to break through the wall of plausible deniability. They mentioned the meetings they knew about, the ones they had photographs of. Michael sitting across from their colleagues in that diner in Borough Park. Salvatore shook his head, his expression troubled. If Michael was meeting with federal agents, it was the first he was hearing about it. Maybe the boy had gambling problems he hadn't mentioned. Maybe he'd gotten mixed up with something. Maybe that's why he'd disappeared. Maybe someone else had gotten to him first, before the family even knew there was a problem. It was masterful, the way he redirected suspicion without ever quite accusing anyone. The way he made it seem like the family was as much in the dark as the FBI. The way he transformed Michael's cooperation into evidence that his own son might have been a liability someone else had eliminated. The agents left with nothing concrete, nothing they could use to build a case or justify further investigation. Michael Vitale had disappeared. That happened sometimes in their world. People vanished when they owed money or broke promises or knew things other people didn't want known. Without a body, without witnesses, without evidence of foul play, there was no crime to investigate, just another missing person in a city full of people who didn't want to be found. Anthony continued running the family's operations with the same methodical efficiency he'd always shown, meeting with union representatives and political fixers, managing the flow of money through their legitimate businesses, keeping the empire functioning the way his father had taught him. But something had changed in him, something his wife Catherine noticed even though she didn't understand its source. He was quieter now, more withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his study, drinking scotch and staring at the wall, coming to bed late and lying awake next to her, his breathing shallow and irregular like he couldn't get enough air. When she asked what was wrong, he told her it was business pressure, nothing she needed to worry about, just the usual complications of managing operations and keeping everyone happy. She didn't believe him, but she didn't push, because that was their arrangement, the price she paid for the house in Bay Ridge, and the charge accounts at the good department stores, and the security of being married to someone powerful. The truth was that Anthony couldn't stop seeing his brother's face in that moment before the trigger was pulled. The resignation and fear and something that might have been forgiveness or might have been accusation, the last expression Michael would ever make before becoming nothing more than memory and concrete. He'd thought it would be clean, that doing what was necessary would bring relief, that protecting the family would provide some kind of moral justification that would let him sleep at night. But instead, he found himself haunted not by ghosts but by the living presence of guilt, the understanding that some actions couldn't be undone, some debts couldn't be repaid, some stains didn't wash out no matter how much time passed or how many rationalizations you constructed. He started going to confession more frequently, showing up at Our Lady of Peace on weekday afternoons when the church was empty, kneeling in the wooden confessional that smelled like old wood and other people's sins, speaking through the screen to Father Dominic, who knew exactly what Anthony had done because the priest had been paid to look the other way when it happened. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Anthony would begin. And then he'd talk around the subject, confessing to anger and pride and lack of charity, using the coded language of Catholic guilt to describe what he couldn't say directly. Father Dominic would assign penance, 10 Hail Marys and 5 Our Fathers, prayers that were supposed to cleanse the soul, but which felt increasingly meaningless, like putting band-aids on a severed artery, At the end of each confession, the priest would remind Anthony that God's mercy was infinite, that all sins could be forgiven, that redemption was possible for everyone. But the priest's voice always carried a weight of doubt, a suggestion that maybe some things were beyond even divine forgiveness, that maybe some choices marked you permanently in ways that no amount of prayer could erase. Christmas came and went, the Vitali family gathering for dinner at Salvatore and Lucia's house the way they did every year, the table set with the good china, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filling the rooms, everyone dressed in their best clothes, pretending this was just another holiday, just another celebration of family and faith and tradition. But Michael's absence was palpable, a hole in the constellation of relatives that everyone navigated around without mentioning, the unspoken understanding that this was what their life was now, this careful dance around the truth, this performance of normalcy built on a foundation of murder. They said grace before eating, Salvatore's voice steady as he thanked God for their blessings, for their health, for their prosperity, for keeping them safe and united. The prayer somehow both sincere and deeply ironic, a plea for protection directed at a deity who was supposed to punish exactly the kind of crime they'd committed. After dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and the men had retreated to the living room with coffee and anisette, Lucia finally broke the silence that had defined their household for 2 months. She was standing at the kitchen sink, washing wine glasses by hand even though she had a perfectly good dishwasher, Maria next to her with a towel, drying each piece and putting it away in the cabinet. "I know he's dead," Lucia said quietly, not looking at her daughter, her hands moving mechanically through the soapy water. "I know your father and Anthony killed him. I know why they did it. And I know I'm supposed to accept it and never speak of it and pretend Michael just disappeared like your father says. But I want you to know, Maria, I want you to understand that this family is poison. Everything we've built, everything your father worked for, it's all built on death and secrets and the willingness to destroy anyone who threatens our position, even our own children." Maria stood frozen, the dish towel in her hands, not knowing what to say, not knowing if her mother wanted comfort or confession or just acknowledgement. Lucia kept washing glasses, her voice never rising above a whisper, tears running down her face, but her hands never shaking. "I loved your father once," she continued. "I believed in him. I thought what he did was necessary, that he was protecting us, that the money and power were worth the cost. But now I know different. Now I understand that we sold our souls a long time ago, and we've just been living on borrowed time, waiting for God to collect his debt. Michael was weak, yes. He betrayed us, yes. He deserved punishment, maybe, but not death. Not from his own father and brother, not in a church. That's not justice, that's murder, and we're all complicit." She turned off the water and dried her hands on her apron, looking at Maria directly for the first time, her eyes red but fierce. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you'll get out. Find a man from a normal family. Someone who works an honest job, who doesn't live in the shadows. Have children, and raise them far away from all of this. Don't let what happened to us happen to you. Don't let this family destroy you the way it destroyed Michael, the way it's destroying your father and Anthony, the way it's destroying me. Promise me that when I die you'll leave Brooklyn and never come back, that you'll pretend you never knew us, that you'll build a life that has nothing to do with what we are." Maria hugged her mother, feeling the older woman's body shaking with grief and rage, the accumulated weight of 33 years of marriage to a man who'd chosen the empire over his own son. "I promise," she whispered, though she didn't know if it was a promise she could keep. Didn't know if anyone really escaped the gravity of the world they were born into. Didn't know if leaving would mean safety, or just a different kind of prison, the cage of guilt and memory instead of the cage of family expectations. They stood like that for a long moment, two women trying to hold each other up in a house full of men who'd learned to mistake violence for strength, who'd confused loyalty with obedience, who'd traded their humanity for the illusion of control. In the living room, Salvatore and Anthony sat in chairs facing each other, the television on but neither of them watching it, the sound of some variety show providing background noise that let them sit in silence without it being too obviously uncomfortable. Salvatore poured another glass of anisette, his hands steadier than they had any right to be, his face showing nothing of what he was feeling. To family, he said, raising his glass. Anthony raised his own, the traditional toast, the one they'd said 1,000 times before. To family, he echoed. They drank, the sweet liquor burning slightly going down, warming their stomachs if not their consciences. Do you think he knew? Anthony asked after a moment. At the end, did he understand why it had to be this way? Salvatore considered the question, rolling his glass between his palms. I think he understood that he'd crossed a line. Whether he accepted that the punishment fit the crime, I don't know. Maybe he thought we'd find another way. Maybe he thought blood would protect him. Maybe he was right, and we were wrong. Anthony looked at his father sharply, surprised. You think we were wrong? Salvatore shrugged, a gesture of weariness more than dismissal. I think we did what we thought we had to do. I think we protected the empire. I think we followed the rules that have kept families like ours alive for centuries. But I also think we're going to hell for it, you and I. And I think we earned that damnation fair and square. The rules don't make us right. They just make us consistent. He stood up slowly, his body protesting, his age finally catching up with the weight he'd been carrying. I'm tired, Anthony. I'm going to bed. You should go home to your wife, enjoy the holiday, pretend we're normal people who don't have blood on our hands. Anthony watched his father leave the room, climbing the stairs to the second floor where Lucia was probably already in bed, lying in the darkness, praying or crying or both. He sat alone for another hour, finishing the bottle of anisette, watching the television without seeing it, wondering what happened to men who killed their brothers, whether there was really a hell waiting, or whether this life, this knowledge, this inability to ever feel clean again, was punishment enough. New Year's came with snow, fat flakes falling over Brooklyn like absolution that would melt by morning. The Vitale family operations continued as they always had, money flowing, orders given, problems handled with the efficiency that came from decades of practice. To the outside world, to the other families, to the politicians and union leaders and businessmen who depended on their cooperation, nothing had changed. The empire was stable. The leadership was solid. Michael Vitale had disappeared, yes, but people disappeared all the time in their world. It was unfortunate but not unprecedented. Life went on, but inside the family something had broken, some fundamental trust or belief or illusion of immunity. They'd proven that blood didn't protect you if you threatened the organization. They demonstrated that loyalty to the empire superseded loyalty to individuals, even when those individuals were sons and brothers. It was a lesson everyone understood, but nobody wanted to acknowledge, the reality that had always been there, but had now been made explicit, carved into their collective consciousness with the same permanence that Michael's body had been carved into that foundation in Queens. Lucia Vitale died in her sleep in March of 1959, 5 months after her son's murder. The doctor said it was her heart, that she'd had a weakness no one knew about, that these things happened. But everyone who knew her understood what had really killed her. She died of grief and complicity, of knowing what her husband and her eldest son had done, of understanding that she'd raised her children in a world where this outcome was not just possible, but inevitable. She'd died of the accumulated weight of all the secrets she'd kept, all the questions she'd never asked, all the times she'd looked the other way and accepted the lies because the truth was too terrible to bear. Her funeral was enormous, hundreds of people filling Our Lady of Peace, every family from every borough sending representatives, flowers arriving by the vanload, the smell of lilies overpowering the usual church scent of incense and candles. Salvatore stood at the front, accepting condolences, his face carved from stone, shaking hands and embracing men who offered sympathy and respect, playing his role perfectly. Anthony stood next to him, Catherine on his other side, both of them dressed in black, both of them performing their grief for the assembled crowd. Maria sat in the first pew, her face hidden behind a veil, crying genuinely, mourning not just her mother, but everything her mother had represented, the last connection to a version of family that wasn't defined entirely by violence and calculation. Father Dominic performed the Mass, his voice echoing through the vaulted space, speaking about Lucia's devotion to her faith, her dedication to her family, her charity and kindness and all the virtues that made her an example of Catholic womanhood. He didn't mention that she'd died knowing her husband had murdered their son. He didn't talk about the price she'd paid for being married to a man who valued his empire over everything else. He didn't acknowledge the fundamental tragedy of her life, that she'd loved people who were incapable of loving her back the way she deserved, that she'd spent decades building a home that was really just an elaborate cage. The eulogy was beautiful and completely false, another performance in a life and death built on performances. They buried Lucia in Greenwood Cemetery, in a plot that had been purchased years earlier, next to spaces reserved for Salvatore and eventually Anthony and Maria. The whole family laid out in a row for eternity, their bones mingling in the Brooklyn soil, their names carved on matching headstones that would weather and fade, but never completely disappear. As they lowered her casket into the ground, Salvatore stood at the edge of the grave, holding a handful of dirt that he would throw on top of the coffin, and for the first time since Michael's death, his face showed real emotion, a crack in the mask, tears running down his weathered cheeks, his mouth working silently like he was trying to say something but couldn't find the words. Maybe he was apologizing, maybe he was asking for forgiveness. Maybe he was just saying goodbye to the only person who'd ever known him completely and loved him anyway, flaws and violence and all. Anthony put his hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture of support or solidarity, or maybe just acknowledgement that they were both alone now in a different way, that Lucia's death had removed the last witness to their humanity, the last person who remembered them as something other than the roles they played in the machinery of organized crime. Without her, they were just criminals, just killers, just men who'd traded their souls for power and were beginning to realize the trade hadn't been worth it. They stood there together as the grave was filled, watching the dirt cover the casket, watching another piece of their family disappear into the earth, adding to the weight of everything they'd already buried, all the secrets and bodies and lies that Brooklyn soil had swallowed over the years. The year that followed Lucia's death was quiet, marked by a kind of slow dissolution that nobody outside the immediate family would have noticed, but which was unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. Salvatore aged rapidly, his hair going completely white, his body shrinking, his hands developing a tremor that made it hard for him to write or hold a coffee cup without spilling. He stopped going to the social clubs, stopped attending meetings, stopped managing the daily operations of the business he'd spent his life building. The doctors called it a series of small strokes, little damages accumulating in his brain, but everyone understood it was something else, the body finally giving up after the mind had already surrendered, the physical manifestation of guilt and exhaustion. Anthony took over completely, running the Vitale empire with the same efficiency he'd learned from his father, but without any of the joy or pride that had once motivated the work. It was just business now, just transactions and problems and decisions that needed to be made. He expanded their operations into Long Island, made new connections with families in Chicago and Detroit, increased their revenue year over year. By every measurable standard, he was successful. The empire was thriving under his leadership, but he was hollowed out inside, going through motions that had lost all meaning, pretending he couldn't feel the weight of his brother's ghost pressing down on him every moment of every day. Catherine left him in the spring of 1960. She didn't make a scene, didn't demand explanations or recriminations. She just packed her things one morning while he was at work and moved back to her parents' house in Bay Ridge, leaving a note on the kitchen table that said she couldn't do this anymore, that she'd tried to be the wife he needed, but she was dying by inches living with a man who was already dead inside, that she hoped he'd find peace someday, but she couldn't wait around to see if that would ever happen. Anthony read the note once and then threw it away, feeling nothing, because nothing was what he felt about everything now. The emotional numbness that came from killing the one person you weren't supposed to kill, from breaking the one rule that was supposed to be sacred. Maria kept her promise to her mother. She met a man named Robert Sullivan, an accountant who worked for a firm in Manhattan, whose family came from Ireland 3 generations back, and who knew nothing about the Vitale family's business, who thought Anthony worked in waste management and that their father was retired. They dated for 6 months, got married in a small ceremony at a church in Queens that wasn't Our Lady of Peace, and moved to Philadelphia, where Robert had been offered a promotion. Maria didn't invite her father or brother to the wedding. She sent them an announcement card after the fact, along with a short letter explaining that she was starting a new life, that she loved them but couldn't be part of their world anymore, that she hoped they'd understand and respect her decision. She didn't mention Michael. She didn't mention the basement or the church or the night her mother had broken down in the kitchen. She didn't need to. Everyone understood what she was escaping. Salvatore Vitale died on October 17, 1960, exactly 2 years to the day after his son Michael had been murdered in the basement of Our Lady of Peace. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, too precise to be accidental. Whether he'd been keeping track of the days, marking time until the anniversary, or whether his body had simply known it was time to stop, nobody could say. He was found in his bedroom by the home health aide who'd been coming daily to help him dress and eat, and manage the basic functions that had become impossible for him to handle alone. He was lying in bed, his hands folded over his chest, his eyes closed, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been in life. On the nightstand next to him was a rosary and a photograph from 1929, Salvatore and Lucia, and their 2 young sons back when the family had been intact, when the future had seemed unlimited, when nobody yet understood the price that prosperity would demand. His funeral was smaller than Lucia's had been, attended mostly by family and a few business associates. The other families sending flowers but not representatives. Their subtle indication that the Vitale organization's prominence was already fading, that without Salvatore's leadership and relationships, they were just another small operation in a city full of them. Anthony stood at the grave next to his father's casket, alone this time because Catherine was gone and Maria had sent a telegram saying she couldn't attend, that she was pregnant and the doctors had advised against travel, which might have been true or might have been an excuse. Either way, it amounted to the same thing. He was the only Vitale left in Brooklyn, the last survivor of a family that had killed itself trying to stay pure, trying to stay strong, trying to maintain an empire that now felt like nothing more than a collection of rackets and payoffs and diminishing returns. Father Dominic performed the service, speaking the same prayers he'd spoken over Lucia, over Michael, though nobody but he and Anthony and Salvatore had known it, over decades of men who'd died in the service of families like the Vitales, men who'd believed in codes and hierarchies and the importance of loyalty and respect. The priest's voice was tired, worn down by years of blessing violence and looking the other way, of taking money from men whose souls he knew were probably beyond redemption, of trying to believe that God's mercy was really infinite, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. After the service, Anthony approached him, pressed an envelope into his hand, money for the church, money for prayers, money to assuage guilt that couldn't be assuaged. The priest took it without comment, without meeting Anthony's eyes, both of them understanding that this was the last time, that the relationship between the Vitale family and Our Lady of Peace was finished, that some places became too contaminated to be useful anymore. Anthony Vitale continued running what remained of the family business for another 18 months, but his heart wasn't in it, hadn't been in it since that night in October 1958, when he'd put a gun to his brother's head and pulled the trigger. The operations started failing, money disappearing, soldiers leaving for other families, connections drying up as word spread that the Vitales were finished, that Anthony was unstable, that the empire built by Salvatore was collapsing under the weight of sins that could no longer be contained. By the summer of 1962, there was almost nothing left, just a few minor rackets that barely generated enough income to cover expenses, just the shell of what had once been one of Brooklyn's most powerful organizations. On July 12, 1962, Anthony Vitale walked into a police station in downtown Brooklyn and asked to speak with a federal agent. They brought him to an interview room, gave him coffee, sat across from him with a tape recorder running, and listened as he confessed. Not to everything. He didn't mention Michael. That was still protected, still sacred in some terrible way. The one crime he wouldn't admit to because doing so would mean acknowledging that it had all been for nothing, that killing his brother to protect the family had resulted only in the family's destruction. But he confessed to racketeering, to bribery, to extortion, to all the business crimes that constituted his life's work, giving the FBI enough information to dismantle what remained of the Vitale operations and to implicate dozens of other people who'd worked with them over the years, They asked him why. Why was he cooperating? Why now? What had changed? Anthony looked at them across the table, these young agents in their clean suits, their law degrees, their certainty that they represented justice and order and the right side of history, and he almost laughed. "Because I'm tired," he told them. "Because everyone I loved is dead or gone. Because the empire we killed my brother to protect doesn't exist anymore. Because I want to see what it feels like to tell the truth for once, even if it's only about crimes that don't matter, even if the real sin stays buried under a building in Queens where nobody will ever find it." The agents looked confused, not understanding the reference, not knowing about Michael, not realizing they were sitting across from a man who'd already been sentenced by a judge more unforgiving than any in the American legal system. Anthony Vitale pleaded guilty to 14 counts of racketeering and extortion. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, time he served quietly, never complaining, never asking for parole, becoming a model prisoner who worked in the library and attended chapel services, and kept to himself. Other inmates knew who he was, knew what family he came from, gave him respect and distance in equal measure. But Anthony didn't want respect. He just wanted the time to pass, wanted the routine of prison life to replace the chaos of the world outside, wanted the concrete walls and bars to be literal instead of metaphorical like they'd been his entire life. He died in prison in 1971, a heart attack at age 54. Collapsed in the recreation yard during an afternoon walk. They sent his body back to Brooklyn for burial, and he was placed in Greenwood Cemetery next to his parents, the 3 graves in a row. Michael's name conspicuously absent from the family plot because officially he'd just disappeared. Because no death certificate had ever been issued, because even in death the lie had to be maintained. The funeral was attended by exactly 2 people, Maria Sullivan, who came alone from Philadelphia, and Father Dominic, now retired but still alive, still carrying the weight of all the confessions he'd heard, all the absolutions he'd given that had meant nothing. Maria stood at her brother's grave after the service, after the priest had left, after the cemetery workers had finished filling in the earth. She looked at the 4 headstones now, her mother and father and Anthony, and thought about Michael, who should have been there but wasn't, who'd been erased not just from the family plot, but from the official record, whose death hadn't even been marked with a stone or a date or an acknowledgement that he'd existed. She thought about her mother's request, the promise to leave and never come back, to build a life unconnected to all of this. She'd kept that promise. She had 3 children now, a house in the suburbs, a husband who treated her well, and who still didn't know about the violence and tragedy that had defined her childhood. Her children had no idea their grandfather had been a crime boss, that their Uncle Anthony had died in prison, that their Uncle Michael had been murdered by his own family. They thought the Vitales were just immigrants who'd done well, that their mother had chosen to move away for her own reasons, that families sometimes drifted apart and that was just how life worked. But standing there in Greenwood Cemetery, looking at those graves, Maria understood something her mother had known but hadn't been able to articulate, that you never really escaped, that the violence and secrets and sins of your family stayed with you no matter how far you moved or how much you tried to reinvent yourself, that every time she looked at her children, she saw traces of the people buried in this soil, genetic markers of corruption and survival, the same dark eyes and strong features that had defined the Vitales for generations, that she could never tell her children the truth about where they came from, because the truth would contaminate them, would mark them with knowledge they couldn't unknow, would burden them with history that wasn't their fault, but which would become their responsibility. She said a prayer, not for forgiveness because she didn't believe forgiveness was possible for what her family had done, but for forgetting, for the mercy of memory fading, for the chance that maybe in another generation or 2, the sins would be diluted enough that they'd lose their power. Then she left the cemetery and drove back to Philadelphia, back to her real life, back to the version of herself that had nothing to do with Brooklyn or basements or the sound of a gunshot echoing in a church. She never returned, never visited the graves again, never spoke to anyone from the old neighborhood. She'd kept her promise to her mother, but the cost was carrying the knowledge alone, being the last living person who knew the complete story of how the Vitale family had destroyed itself, trying to stay pure, trying to protect an empire that wasn't worth protecting, trying to maintain a code that demanded the sacrifice of the very thing it claimed to hold sacred. The building in Queens, where Michael Vitale's body had been buried, was torn down in 1985, part of an urban renewal project that cleared several blocks of old apartment buildings to make way for new construction. During the demolition, heavy equipment broke through foundations and basements, pulverizing the concrete that had entombed Michael for 27 years. His remains, if they were found, weren't identified. They were probably just mixed in with all the other rubble, loaded into dump trucks, carried away to landfills where the bones of the city went to rest, indistinguishable from broken concrete and twisted rebar and all the other detritus of buildings that had outlived their usefulness. In Philadelphia, Maria Sullivan watched the news coverage of the Queens demolition on television, recognized the address even though they didn't mention it specifically, understood that her brother was being destroyed for the second time, his bones crushed under the weight of progress and development, his final resting place eliminated so completely that it would be impossible for anyone to ever find him, to ever mark where he'd ended up, to ever acknowledge that he'd existed at all. She thought about calling someone, telling someone, confessing what she knew so that Michael could at least have a death certificate, a final accounting of his life and death. But who would she call? The police? The FBI? What would she say? That 30 years ago, her father and brother had killed her other brother in a church basement and buried him in a foundation in Queens. What good would that do? Everyone involved was dead. The empire they'd killed him to protect was dissolved. The only thing that would accomplish would be dragging her own family into the spotlight, marking her children with their grandfather's sins, destroying the normal life she'd built precisely to escape this kind of knowledge. So she said nothing. She kept the secret the way her mother had kept it, the way everyone in families like hers kept secrets, locked inside where they could fester and rot and slowly poison everything they touched. She lived another 23 years, dying in 2008 at age 75, her children and grandchildren surrounding her hospital bed, holding her hands, telling her they loved her, having no idea that she was carrying knowledge that would have shattered their understanding of who they were if she'd ever decided to share it. She took the secret to her grave, buried in Philadelphia, far from Brooklyn, in a cemetery where the headstones were neat and uniform and carried no suggestion of the violence and tragedy that had defined the previous generation. The story of the Vitale family faded into obscurity, mentioned occasionally in books about organized crime in the 1950s and 60s, a minor footnote about a Brooklyn family that had briefly been influential before collapsing under internal pressure. Historians noted that the organization had been unusual for its rapid decline, speculating about federal pressure or internal conflicts or changing economics of organized crime. But nobody knew the real story, the human story, the tragedy of a family that had killed its own son and brother to protect its empire and had discovered too late that the empire wasn't worth the sacrifice, that blood loyalty meant nothing when it came into conflict with business. That purity was just another word for destruction. The basement of Our Lady of Peace Church, where Michael Vitale had been murdered, was renovated in the 1990s, converted into a community center with new lighting and fresh paint and linoleum flooring that covered the spot where his blood had pooled all those years ago. Children played there now, after-school programs and youth groups, their laughter echoing in the space where a man had begged for his life and been denied mercy by his own family. The church itself declined along with the neighborhood, membership falling, the congregation aging and dying, until finally in 2012, the Archdiocese closed it permanently, merging the parish with another church 6 blocks away. The building was sold to a developer who converted it into condominiums, luxury apartments for young professionals who wanted to live in historic Brooklyn, who paid premium prices to live in a former church, who found the high ceilings and stained glass windows charming and had no idea about the violence and corruption and tragedy that had unfolded in those spaces. Father Dominic had died in 1989, at age 82, his last years spent in a retirement home for priests in upstate New York, his mind mostly gone, dementia erasing his memories but not his guilt, his last lucid moments spent asking for forgiveness for sins he couldn't quite remember but knew he'd committed, muttering about basements and families and the price of silence. He was buried in a cemetery for clergy, his grave marked with a simple stone that identified him as a priest who'd served the Brooklyn community for 40 years, a faithful shepherd who'd guided his flock. No mention of the moral compromises he'd made, the times he'd looked away when he should have intervened, the blood money he'd accepted in exchange for his complicity. By 2025, there was almost nothing left. The people who'd known the Vitalis were dead. The buildings where they'd done business had been demolished or renovated beyond recognition. The police files on Michael's disappearance had been digitized and buried in archives that nobody accessed anymore. The cemetery where Anthony and Salvatore and Lucia were buried was still there, still maintained, but nobody visited those graves. Maria's children, who would have been their grandchildren, didn't know those graves existed. The Vitali name had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. The family reduced to a few mentions in historical books that almost nobody read. A cautionary tale about the dangers of organized crime that meant nothing to people who'd never lived in that world, who couldn't understand the codes and pressures and terrible logic that had led ordinary people to commit extraordinary violence against their own flesh and blood. The only thing that remained was the story itself, preserved in whatever records existed, in whatever memories lingered, in the DNA of descendants who carried genetic markers of corruption and survival without knowing where they came from. The story of how one family had killed its own son, its own brother, in a misguided attempt to maintain purity, to protect an empire that wasn't worth protecting, to uphold standards that were hollow and meaningless and ultimately self-destructive. The story of how violence, even violence committed in the name of family loyalty, inevitably consumed everyone it touched, leaving nothing but graves and silence and the lingering question of whether any of it had been necessary, whether there had been another way, whether the price paid had been worth whatever temporary security it had purchased. The rain that fell on Brooklyn in October 1958 eventually stopped. The streets dried, life continued, but the stain remained invisible to everyone who hadn't been there, who didn't know what had happened, who couldn't see the blood that had soaked into the floorboards and foundations and bedrock of the city. Some places remembered, even when the people who lived there didn't. Some buildings carried the weight of sins committed within their walls. Some families bore curses not because of supernatural intervention, but because of the very human tendency to repeat patterns, to make the same mistakes, to believe that violence could be controlled and contained and used for protective purposes, when history showed again and again that it couldn't, that it always spread, always contaminated, always extracted a price higher than anyone imagined when they first made the decision to pay it. The Vitali family's empire lasted less than 40 years. The consequences lasted forever. That was the lesson, if there was one, if anything meaningful could be extracted from tragedy and waste, and the slow destruction of people who'd started with good intentions, or at least understandable ones, and had ended as cautionary tales about the cost of moral compromise. That empires built on blood would be destroyed by blood. That families that valued loyalty above love would discover too late that loyalty without love was just obedience, and obedience demanded by fear couldn't sustain anything lasting or worthwhile. That purity was impossible in a corrupt world, and attempting to maintain it through violence was like trying to clean bloodstains with more blood. Each attempt to fix the problem only making it worse, spreading the contamination further, ensuring that eventually everything and everyone would be stained beyond recognition. In the end, the Vitali family didn't keep their empire pure. They destroyed it. And in destroying it, they destroyed themselves slowly and completely, until nothing remained but these words, this accounting, this attempt to make sense of how ordinary people could commit extraordinary crimes against those they supposedly loved most. How the machinery of organized crime could grind up entire families and spit them out as nothing more than forgotten names on gravestones nobody visited. How the pursuit of power and security and respect could lead intelligent people to make decisions so catastrophically wrong that their consequences echoed through generations, poisoning lives that hadn't even been conceived when the original sin was committed. The story ended not with revelation or redemption, but with silence, the same silence that had defined the Vitali family from the beginning, the silence that had protected them and ultimately destroyed them. The silence that remained long after everyone involved was dead and forgotten, long after the buildings had been demolished and the graves had been abandoned, long after the last person who remembered what happened had taken that knowledge to their own grave, leaving nothing behind but the story itself, preserved here. A warning or a memorial, or simply an acknowledgement that these things happened, that families destroyed themselves in the name of preservation, that blood was spilled by blood in the endless cycle of violence and consequence that characterized the world these people inhabited. A world that still exists in different forms, with different families making the same mistakes, paying the same prices, learning the same lessons too late to matter.